day 1 of SWPA, and I'm Dr. Elaine Disco-Rondon, your culturally sensitive and inclusive certified grief counselor. And today, the main takeaway I want y'all to get from this session is that everybody is entitled to their grief. Therefore, despite any demographic groups that we or the clients who we serve are a part of, all of our grief is meaningful and deserves respect and honor. I'm first going to briefly introduce myself to set the context, then cover grief support challenges and strategies with you today, and as time permits, hopefully have a simulation. But if we don't have time today, I strongly encourage you to get with any of your colleagues and peers or trusted loved ones to practice culturally sensitive grief counseling with them. But I definitely want to make time for questions and answers as well as comments. So feel free to interject at any time if you want to pitch in anything that you have learned through your own counseling services or support of grief. Now, for myself, I'm part of these demographics. I'm Filipina, which is an Asian ethnicity, and I practice Roman Catholicism, which is a denomination of Christianity. And I'm married to a Mexican American, so we have an intercultural household, and together my husband and I are parents of cats, as well as bereaved parents of our oldest cat, Asia, who you saw on our cover slide, in addition to my emotional support animal, Annie, and a handful of more cats inside and ferals outside. We're also bereaved parents of both of our unborn children, Angel and Divine, and they were our inspirations to co-found our public charity, which is a NOCCO 501c3, which is how I offer grief counseling support ministry, and I specialize in pet loss support. Through the AIHCP's American Academy of Grief Counseling, I also designed and now teach the grief diversity specialty curriculum to certified grief counselors. And I've taught college for most of my adulthood. And apparently every time I go through a slide, I have to show my face again so it'll open back up. Today I'm not going to specifically cover all of the global cultures because that could take forever. I just want to provide a brief overview so that way you can serve your clients with the specific demographic groups that they come from, whether it be cultures or world religions, or BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous Peoples, and People of Color, as well as the LGBTQIA+ community, and lastly, with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD. Now, for religions, many organized religions may believe that the life goes on after a body dies, but the soul may live on. However, different religions, depending on denominations and subsects, may celebrate memorial services differently, dispose of the bodies differently, and go through the grieving process differently. With Buddhism, they use all 4 of the earth's elements, including the earth through burial, immersion through water, exposure through air, and also fire through cremation. Christians may bury or cremate their dead. Hindus go through cremation and immersion with their deceased, and both Jewish and Muslim people may bury after a ritualistic cleansing of the body. Also, Buddhists may value merit making more than an elaborate ceremony to memorialize the dead. Christians may have a viewing of the body, may or may not, and may have a public or a private ceremony depending on the deceased and the family members and the people who knew that loved one. Hindus tend to be elaborate with memorial services, and some may extend for long periods of time, including as many as 2 weeks, involving the immediate extended families as well as the broad community who knew the loved one, versus Jewish people who may have simple funerals very close as possible to the death date in order to prevent the mourning process to be delayed. And Muslim people may have comforting rituals that prompt certain grief responses. Now, in terms of expressing emotions and going through a bereavement process, Buddhists abstain from alcohol and alums, including garlic and onion. Christians may wear certain colors, whether it be white or black or another color, to reflect on the loved one who just died. For example, in my Filipino culture, we may wear white after somebody dies for about a year, and there's a superstition called SWPA where if somebody gets married or more than 2 relatives get married after a loved one within the family dies, then that's supposed to be bad luck. And then we have a 1-year ceremony after the funeral and after the person dies called Babang Luksa. So we have different celebrations in that respect in my Filipino Catholic tradition. Hindus strongly accept external emotions being expressed, but may have limited verbal communication or exchanges of words. And they adhere to a strict vegetarian diet. And Jewish people may have round foods to celebrate the cycle of life when somebody dies. And Muslims accept attachment and continued connection with the deceased. But the challenges that may take place when a loved one dies in world religions is that some individuals may express their emotions differently than what is socially acceptable from their own religions. And what may even complicate matters for grievers is if they live in an area different from their culture of origin, where they may lack support in the grief rituals that their respective cultures and religions have celebrated. So it is up to us as grief supporters to really exercise these 2 L's. And hopefully that looks like an L from here. I mean, not L for loser, but L for listening and learning. We want to listen to the griever express their thoughts and feelings surrounding the grief. And we also want to make sure that we learn more about the specific cultures and religions that they come from and determine with them what they feel comfortable with doing to cope with hope and deal to heal. As far as people of color are concerned, African Americans may not be very receptive. I'm not saying all, but some may not be very receptive towards professional grief support due to historically experiencing negative experiences with public systems. In addition to being part of already tight-knit religious groups and communities where they seek their support. Now, in memorial services, some African Americans may celebrate with having open expressions of emotions. However, after the memorial service, bereavement may take place where expectations may be to internalize emotions, to stay strong. For Indigenous peoples, mental health is their source of strength, but admittedly, a natural response to grief with any of us, regardless of the demographic groups that we come from, may be fear. And even Indigenous peoples, despite the mental health and strength that they so value may also dread when death is near. Latinx and African Americans, in particular adolescents, may experience what's called disenfranchised grief, which is grief that is experienced where the surrounding society or communities may not be as supportive, because some of the losses that children or adolescents or teenagers, young people in African American and Latinx communities may also include incarceration or drug abuse or crimes or accidents or homicides or suicides, unfortunately. And Asian Americans, such as myself, may have been considered part of a model race because we may have experienced internalized racism, meaning that we experienced discrimination, but instead of fighting against it, we just kept it within ourselves. But since the COVID-19 pandemic, fortunately, more people are speaking out in defense of Asian Americans being targets of hate crimes. And unfortunately, we also experienced hate crimes in the forms of losses of African Americans, as we know, in the public eye. In 2020, when the pandemic first started, we lost Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and many people the world over experienced collective grief. They may not have known these victims personally, but we still felt a very deep loss because it hit a group of people, of innocent people, who did not deserve that traumatic torment. We ourselves, as helping professionals, may experience what's called vicarious trauma, which means that we also may experience distress from somebody else's grief or trauma. For example, I serve bereaved parents of children and animals. So if I were to hear somebody out and ruminate about the circumstances surrounding the deaths of my own babies, then that would set me back as a professional. In order to prevent burnout from vicarious trauma, we also have to focus on our own self-care. And some of these methods are in the next slide in terms of helping grievers of color and grievers of other demographic groups. First of all, with African Americans, we have the Trios model, which stands for T for time, R for rhythm, I for improvisation, O for oral communication, and S for spirituality, because those are important elements in the African American culture. For indigenous peoples, in terms of their mental health, when they seek strength through grief, we can turn to the medicine wheel for guidance. And for any specific ethnicity or nationality, it is up to us as supporters to research the different cultures of the clients who we serve in order to determine whether those culturally acceptable grief rituals are ones that they feel comfortable doing. But they can even explore other cultures. In indigenous medicines, there's also traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic, Indian-based medicine, or even Latinx-based curanderas, which are spiritual healers, as well as Urberias, which are herbal shops. So we don't have to even stay within our own cultures. If we open up our minds and see if our clients may feel comfortable turning to those routes. And we can also have other forms of self-care for ourselves going through vicarious trauma, as well as the grievers who we support, including journaling and meditation and low-impact exercises such as yoga or Tai Chi or any other holistic medicine methods like acupuncture or Reiki. Any of those may do wonders, but again, grief support and counseling is not one size fits all. We have to make sure that we work together with the griever who we are supporting to figure out what they want and they prefer. Does anybody have any questions or comments based on your own experiences that you want to share with us? All right, well now on to the LGBTQIA+ communities. The research that I've done more focuses on gay widowers of male partners and lesbian widows of female partners. Not enough research is out there yet on how transgender and non-binary individuals cope with grief. But what I did find about gay widowers ties in with another term that I want us to remember called anticipated grief, which is grief that we expect to experience when we know that a looming circumstance is near, like imminent death, terminal illness. In particular, in the 1980s and 90s, with the AIDS epidemic, many gay partners experienced that. So the terminally ill patient would have to prepare to die. Unfortunately, the symptoms they would expect to have. And their loved ones, including their romantic partners, would have to get ready for life without that loved one physically present with them. Therefore, gay widowers tend to gravitate more towards grief support, where somebody is there with an ear open to listen to them. In particular, somebody who may have experienced a similar loss, whether it be through grief counseling or another peer or in a support group of other gay widowers. Lesbian widows may tend to value the emotional connections with their partners, including the ones who they have lost, even more so than physical or sexual intimacy. Now, some LGBTQ+ individuals may have the support of their loved ones and their respective religious groups. Some wholeheartedly support them, or some may be hesitant and eventually warm up to their sexual identities and sexual orientations, but unfortunately not all have that support. And factors can complicate matters if they also lack socioeconomic resources to be able to afford professional resources, including professional grief counseling or support services. They may be in rural areas that may not have those ready at their disposal, or they may not be able to afford them. Therefore, it is up to us as grief professionals and supporters to offer alternative options, such as what I offer through virtual meetings for grief support, as well as on a sliding scale to make it more affordable for them, or even pro bono or free of charge. And the other self-care methods that we covered for people of color can also be effective for grievers from the LGBTQIA+ community, in addition to animal companionship, which many lesbian widowers and gay widowers and lesbian widows have also warmed up to. We also want to know what LGBTQIA+ affirming support have worked for them, because sometimes they can be part of a group and feel like others are not as supportive. So it really is a matter of finding the right fit for them in terms of self-care and in terms of finding a supportive network. Last but not least, we're going to focus on individuals with intellectual and developmental disability, or IDD. Now, a mistake that some family members and caretakers of IDD individuals is to treat them like children, when experiencing a loss. And these losses may not always be losing a loved one to death. They may also include losing a staff member or a friend at a group home because that person may have moved away, or unfortunately, some individuals with IDD may lose their lives or may lose their friends at a young age because not all of them live to a normal human lifespan. Now, some caretakers and family members may use euphemisms, bless you, and sugarcoat the situation. Like, if somebody dies, they might say, oh, well, that person or that animal is just sleeping, and that can throw somebody with IDD off. Also, some individuals with IDD might be left out of the memorial services, might not even be involved in the grief rituals that are remembering a loved one. And we have to remember, the main takeaway I want us to get today is that we must honor and respect everybody's grief, including individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And not all of them have the motor skills to be able to articulate effectively. So we have to come up with alternative ways to communicate with them. If they are mute or nonverbal, visual communication can do wonders. And oh goodness, I was going to show you I was going to try to zoom in on this particular heart as an example of ways that we can honor the grief of an individual with intellectual or developmental disabilities. They can include photos of the loved one in a heart, or displaying mementos that remind them of that loved one for about a month, but also even make a brief ritual of taking them down and storing them properly. So that way they know that the connection may always be there, but do it in a healthy way where they can still honor the memory of that loved one, but not be too attached to them. Because with individuals with IDD, we have to make sure that they stay on a routine, and we do whatever is possible to avoid disrupting their routine. But at the same time, giving them that safe space where they feel free to express their emotions. Music can also be a good way of remembering the loved one, or even preparing a meal with food that they may have shared with the loved one. Just anything that they feel comfortable doing. But it is a matter of us making sure that we acknowledge and honor their grief. Now, here are the do's and don'ts of culturally sensitive grief support, and we'll actually start with the left column on the don'ts to tie them in with the do's on the left side. We do not want to assume that, you know the first three letters of assume. We don't want to be that and think that just because a client, once we sign off on a client agreement and we're aware of some of their demographic groups, that we're going to know what they need right off the bat. We do have to listen to their needs and their wants. We also don't want to impose our own beliefs and practices on our clients. Maybe we can tell them what worked for us and suggest it, but we're not going to shove it down their throats. We are going to learn more about their cultures to determine what may work and check with them as well. We don't want to stereotype them just because they identify with a certain group. And we do want to focus on our clients' experience sharing and also making meaning out of those experiences. And last but not least, we do not want to consider counseling as something that we do to a client. We do approach counseling, whether it include grief support or otherwise, something that is a collaborative, joint, and team effort. We are working together, and in this case, we have the grief work that we share. We want to empower and hold our clients accountable for their healing as well. And I want to give us time for questions and comments before we do the simulation, but for the simulation, if we do have time, we can partner up and introduce ourselves, and one person be the grief counselor and the other person be the griever, and the griever will share the demographics, and the grief counselor will determine appropriate grief healing methods based on today's presentation and what the griever shared with them to determine what may help with their healing. And here is my information on my nonprofit that offers grief support, including pet loss grief support, as well as my sources, and I'll backtrack this as well. But before we partner up, and if we do have an odd amount, either we can partner up with me, or we can have a team of 3 where one person is the grief counselor and 2 are the grievers, and we could probably devote maybe even 5 to 10 minutes to that. But first, I do want to address any questions and answer them or field any comments right now. If anybody cares to share what they've gone through. How about you?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, since therapy is, you're really responding to what the client brings, trying not to superimpose your own experience, right. How do you take what you know about grief and like multiculturalism and not be like, oh, like you fit into this group, like have you tried this culturally, this approach that people from your culture use? Do you just wait for them to bring it up naturalistically and then ask them if that's a good fit for them right now, and then kind of validate that, or do you take a more heavy-handed approach and be like, have you attempted to like, go out and be supported right lately?
I like the options that you pointed out, and I would say the second one that you pointed out, which would be to listen to them, would be our first step. We want to listen to them first and foremost. Yes, of course, we want to also include the second option that you mentioned, where we bring up what has worked for other grievers from their respective cultures, but we want to listen to them first and foremost, because even if they come from a certain culture, they have different experiences, including even being part of that culture. Whether it's their grief responses, they may differ or coincide with what is socially acceptable in their respective groups. But I like that you were very thorough with your question, because I think you actually answered it on your own.
Well, it's like, so I guess like what you're conveying to me is in the group is like there's an impetus on us to just get this knowledge, like have this information for when we do come across a client that might be outside of our typical demographics, so that when they bring up how their culture might grieve a little differently, we at least know what they have to be referencing, and they can kind of sit with them with that. I don't know. I'm new to grief counseling and everything, so I'm trying to learn as much as I can.
Well, welcome to the world of grief counseling, and I really appreciate you for bringing this up, because at the same time, we don't want to make that grief support overwhelming for the griever. As a matter of fact, the first session I would recommend mostly listening and taking notes of what the griever is saying to you about the loss. And then once you find out the different cultural groups that that griever is a part of, then research more about those cultures, and then come back at the next session and say, this is what has, based on research evidence, has worked for other grievers in your groups, and explore it together. Now, for grief support, usually it doesn't just take place in just one session where we just knock it out and, oh, that person is done. And many times grief is a lifelong process. Those of us who've lost somebody very important to us, that may be a lifelong process. But it's a matter of guiding the grievers in a direction to function normally throughout their lives. This is a different normal, and I can't even just say normal like, oh, there's a universal normal. It's what's going to be normal for them, where they are not just set back and want to just stay in bed all day and not get up and not continue living. We have to remind our fellow grievers that the life does go on. We're not saying, oh, move on from your grief or move past your grief. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. The grief may always be there, because grief comes from loving someone or something so deeply that when that important part is taken away from your life, it's a matter of finding out how to live your life in a way where you may still have a connection with that part of your life, but you also have to adapt to your life without them physically present, especially for those who have families and other obligations. We can't leave our other loved ones or our other priorities hanging. So what may be recommended with grief counseling in particular may be 5 to 10 sessions, where you're listening and learning from the griever, and y'all are working together and tracking that person's progress. But that's an excellent question. Yes?
I cannot remember the specific amount of weeks, but I know that there's a certain amount of point when we were talking about like they want to stay in bed all day. I know there's a certain amount of weeks until it's considered chronic depression. So what has been your past process with working with people who have had that grief, and then you may think they may have chronic depression? Do you refer them to someone else?
Yes. They would have to definitely see an LPC or even a psychiatrist at that point, depending on the mental illness, because for certified grief counselors, we're not treating for mental illness, we're just treating for grief, because grief can be a natural response to anybody who may or may not be suffering from a mental illness. But the grief does indeed get more complicated if there already has been a pre-diagnosed condition. But sometimes if the grief still is extended and does become complicated past 2 to 3 months, then they may need to have a mental health professional in the form of therapy or prescriptions if needed. That's a really good question too.
I was wondering if you had any success with sort of challenging people's belief that grief is a process with a finish, and that made you sort of feel like, gosh, I'm still feeling this way after 3 months. I thought I would be past it.
That's a really good question. Well, there isn't, I have to remind my clients that there isn't always an end to grief, but there is healing in the long run, and they also have to be responsible for their own healing. Now, I haven't had beliefs or my credentials challenged or anything of that nature, but I would have to remind the grievers that even if it may be a lifelong process, the healing is there. But if we are going to use any metaphors for grief, I would use the waves. Grief comes in waves. Like, for instance, with me losing my kitty 3 years ago, I can have happy days, but then exactly a week ago she would have turned 17, and I retreat back and I think, oh goodness, I miss Asia so much. But we may backtrack to those sad feelings, but we have to remind ourselves to prevent vicarious trauma and burnout, and also our fellow grievers not to ruminate around the sad circumstances surrounding the loss or the death. We have to remind, like in terms of pet loss, because I know some of us have experienced pet loss, the biggest form of advice I can give any bereaved pet parent is not to ruminate about the sad memories of the death. We have to focus on the good memories, how they made our lives better. I know the day that my cat died. My bishop, who is my main spiritual mentor, Bishop Mike, sent me at 11:11, the angel numbers, an image of St. Francis of Assisi, who is known to be the patron saint of God's creation, his creatures and his the planet Earth. Whether or not any of us believe in the powers of St. Francis of Assisi, there is World Animals Day on October 5th, which is the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi. My point is, Bishop Mike reminded me to remember what Asia taught me, what I learned from my pet parenthood, or what any of us and our bereavers who we support have learned. How did this important part of your life impact your life? Because even if that important part of your life is gone, we can still remember them fondly. We can still use the impact that they made on our lives today, what they've taught us, the lessons that we learned from them, and the experiences that we had from them. But that's a really good question. Grief can be a lifelong process. The grief may not completely end, but there is a point where we can heal and we can continue living while still having that important loved one still, part of our memories and still not too far from us. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, appreciate it, Professor. Yes.
I feel like we also should be mindful of like the neurological standpoint and factors into grief.
Oh yeah.
With that, like there's certain, when you become accustomed to a pattern, your neurological patterns and thought processes are accustomed to that. So then taking that factor when you say it being a lost one or a change in job, change in maybe a road route that you've taken, there's a pattern that you're accustomed to. So when you take that away, it still is used to that same thing. So even in grief, because statistically when removing any type of pattern, it takes about half of the time that pattern has been accustomed to you to like kind of get used to, okay, this is not what we're doing anymore, but also being mindful of that factoring of as much as there's a difference of like, you can't really, this is personal, but like, I don't think you can move on from something, but learning how to move forward with something, because it's still neurologically will be there, but understanding, okay, how can I continue in these thought processes moving forward with it? Because
Excellent
there's like
point.
other factors into it to not feel as though like, oh, I have to get over this, or oh, this has to, move on, because no, that is a part of, personally, I think, your story, your growth, and your
I love that. Amen to that, because we do have to consider the neuropathological effects, because this grief indeed is a transitional process. As a matter of fact, there have been studies that have shown grievers who have undergone MRIs, including bereaved parents, for example, mothers who may have lost their pregnancies or early neonatal loss of an infant, and their neurological responses compared to those who have suffered from drug addiction, because they had that longing and that yearning for that loved one. So that really is an excellent point. And other examples of grief that were just mentioned include, the job transitions, or like some who are parents of adults, maybe you've experienced or know somebody who's experienced an empty nest, and that can even be grief-stricken, because parents of adult children may miss their kids when they move away, whether they join the military or go to college or start a family of their own, have jobs of their own. So grief, can come in different forms aside from death, but also life changes and can really affect us psychologically and physiologically.
Okay, so I have a question that touches up on death a little bit. So
Yeah,
in your experience, do you feel like people have the perceptions they do about death depending on like where they are in their culture? Like I know people that live in westernized cultures tend to view death more like as a negative thing versus in other cultures where yes, they're sad, but they see it as a celebration of life. And
that's an incredible question, because yes, westernized versus Eastern cultures, Eastern civilizations, some may in the Eastern civilizations may face death with more acceptance, like, oh, this is the higher power's will. So this is going to happen anyway to all of us. Whereas in many Western cultures, many of us who are Westernized may approach death with a negative connotation because it's something that something that the general public may not want to face, or they may not want to face losing a loved one to death, because then they're going to live life without the ones who they love. So that is an excellent question. And even in some Eastern cultures, even if some may accept death more than some Western cultures, some individuals still may have a tough time with coping with death. For example, in the research that I came across, there were some bereaved mothers who were expected to move on with their lives, or widows or widowers expected to marry another spouse right away, but they're still mourning the child who they lost, or they're still mourning the spouse who they lost, but oh, well, death is a part of life, you know, just move on. And I like this example pointed out a few minutes ago. The key word, instead of moving on, we got to move forward. That's a good key word replacement. Instead of on, forward. I mean, we've got to, but yes, in terms of accepting death as a society, unfortunately, some individuals may not even coincide with that, or vice versa. Some people who are Westernized or in a dominant Westernized culture may accept death maybe even more wholeheartedly than the majority of the people around them. So there may be some outliers or some exceptions of individuals within their respective societies or groups. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I don't know if you did any research with your clients to find out as they move forward, if there were some that were healed in a way that it seemed more holistic in a shorter span of time than others who it took a much longer time. And if those people had a belief in reincarnation and understanding spiritual ideas, so there was not a finalization or completion or termination of that person passing, but just changing form.
Yes.
Do you find that with those people they were able to heal, not, I don't want to say faster, but were they able to go back, or go forward, move forward with their lives a lot better?
Yeah. Oh, wow.
As a whole group. Yeah. As a whole.
You know, they may be correlated, come to think of it, because if they've already had that belief system into place of the new form after the physical death, and then going through, like, for example, Reiki or acupuncture, they have tended to heal in a shorter period of time compared to those who may not have that belief system. And also, thank you for reminding me. I should have also pointed out, in terms of cultures and world religions, that not just religious traditions are celebrated now in memorials and observed in bereavement, but we also have to also consider secular practices and spiritual but not religious practices now. It's not always limited to structured religion. There are even virtual memorial services now where not all the grievers can be present. So grief can be recognized in different ways and other healing methods as well.
I was just going to add on to that. I know the Journal of Death Studies has a lot on comparing like religious groups and like faith ratings and like long-term bereavement. Atheists are like at super high risk for complications in grief, especially young atheists, along with death anxiety as well. So there's a lot in there already.
I like that. Thank you for this point.
You actually reminded me of a good point when you said that. So like during the pandemic, did you notice like anything different with the way people grieve? Like, because you know how sometimes people didn't even get to see their loved ones.
Oh,
So
yeah.
did you see any like change in that, or like did it get?
It made it way more complicated because unfortunately not everybody got to even have a proper goodbye, or maybe even the disposal of the body was just not what we would expect. For example, I know of a griever whose grandmother in her 90s died a couple of years ago in February of 2021. Was not buried until over a month later in March of 2021, and by then her body was decomposing. Despite the embalmment, I mean, the funeral directors and staff can only do so much, and her corpse, unfortunately, during the viewing was almost unrecognizable. So, and of course, with knowing somebody is going to die and not even being able to visit them at the hospital is extremely heartbreaking, because you would think, well, I want the person or the animal's last moments to be with me so they'll have a sense of comfort when they go, but unfortunately it wasn't always the case with the limitations to COVID-19. That's a really good point. Oh, yes.
Just really quickly, kind of going along with what you were saying, I feel like grief is a lot about figuring out who you are now and what your life looks like post, your loved one passing. I feel like there can be a lot of identity change, a change in like roles and responsibilities depending on like your situation. So it's like, okay, like who am I now? What do I do? Like I guess it's me now, So I feel like it's like figuring out, who am I now? And what does my life look like?
That is true, because roles definitely change. Like if there's a loss of a parent, maybe one of the children steps up to help the widow or widower, the surviving parent, or losing a child. We also have to consider the siblings involved as well, and how everybody within that unit or that system is going to cope together. That we also have to remind the grievers that they are not alone, that others may be grieving alongside with them, and roles may change, but the support system can be there. We want to remind those grievers that we're there to help, but they may also have family and other important people to help.
Well, that's really good. I think
Thank
also
you.
being mindful of, like, we're creatures of habit, so
True.
I hate to say things are, I don't want to categorize it as a challenge, because some may view challenge as negative and some may view it as positive, but it can be a challenge because of us being creatures of habit. So any type of change, immediately we like habit, we enjoy, because there's comfort in that.
Yes.
There's comfort in reoccurring stability. And so with that, I feel as though it's depending on how one might perceive it. Are they gonna not enjoy, but understand, I'm gonna endure this to then know what the growth that it'll take, or am I going, this is something that I don't, so that it's where it's this push and pull too.
Oh yeah, there could be that resistance against going through those routines again when the life transition makes it different. But a key word that you mentioned that I've always valued in my own life is endurance. And we do want to empower our grievers to endure. It may be something that they may want to combat at first, because they may not want to go through that. There may also be that sense of guilt or shame that, oh, well, why should I go through this experience when so-and-so is no longer with me anymore? But I try to remind them, and sometimes even myself as a fellow griever, that even though that person or that animal is not physically with us, or that part of our life is no longer with us in that moment or that place and time, that they're still part of it. I try to use the word honor a lot, that, oh, well, even though you don't have this important loved one with you, or this important part of your life with you, you're honoring that part of your life by doing this certain activity or engaging in this experience. For example, I used to visit my first baby's grave in between work when I taught face-to-face, and I would visit and eat lunch with my child just like I would if my child was alive. But then, life and circumstances happened where I no longer could always visit her grave on the daily. And at first I felt guilty about that, but then I realized, well, I'm still honoring her by, you know, doing these other activities like my nonprofit or the grief support. So we have to approach it that way, that we're honoring them through that endurance that you pointed out. Yes.
I just have a more specific question, and it's just out of curiosity.
Sure.
Have you seen any, I know there's more research coming out with this, but what have you seen when it comes to research when it comes to siblings who lost a fellow sibling? Because I know you kind of mentioned that earlier about different roles changing.
Well, now there are more support services available. For example, where I live down south in the Rio Grande Valley, we have the Children's Bereavement Center, where children who have lost siblings, because the pecking order may be different. Maybe they lost a younger sibling, or their mom lost the baby in the womb, or maybe an older sibling. And there are different coping activities that can, you know, channel their creativity, such as drawing or coloring. A lot of the visual arts can be exercised, children and adults alike, but in particular, children who are mourning the losses of their siblings. Also, the talks therapy, of course, talking about their sibling when they were alive, the fond memories that they shared, maybe even facing some of the sad memories. Other methods that may take place in specific grief therapies can even include the EMDR, the eye desensitization movement reprocessing method, or the tapping method if the grief may be complicated. Because I haven't seen research on this yet, but I would be curious to find out about twin studies. If there are a lot of twins who have been surveyed about the death of their twin or triplet or so on sibling. But that is a really good question.
Okay, so to piggyback off of that too.
Sure.
Have you worked with, first of all, have you worked with children in the grief process? And if so, do they have an easier, or are they able to express themselves more openly than what an adult would? Because, you know, they're still being molded, and like, is it easier, not easy to diagnose, but like, is it, for you, are you able to get through to them real, like, quickly? Like, like, get them to talk about it?
What I've noticed, even though there are different mental developments in the lifespan, I've noticed some children being very articulate versus some adult grievers who are more reserved. And the reason why is because some children may feel inclined to express their emotions, and we as grief supporters want to establish that safe space for them to make sure that they know that there is no threat against them, that they can feel comfortable with expressing themselves. Compared to some adult grievers who don't want to break down and be transparent about their emotions because they have already been conditioned to internalize their feelings and to only express their emotions when appropriate, whether it be behind closed doors or with somebody who they trust. If they come to me and they don't know me from Adam, they may be more hesitant compared to children with expressing their grief. So that's a really good question.
And I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, hit us.
But on
This
that
is
topic,
valuable information.
So, in some cases, there have been situations where, people are actually comfortable, like, having someone, like a third party. Have you ever came across that? Like, some people are, like, adults, children, or whatever, that they're able to open up right away because, you know, you don't know them and they don't know you, and like,
It's actually encouraged because, in particular, what I came across in my research of African American grief, some may not feel comfortable with just facing a professional grief counselor or supporter, but if somebody from their respective religious group, whether it be a church or church leader, or clergy member, or a family member, that intervention is encouraged because then they feel more inclined to share, and not just with somebody who they don't know personally, but somebody who is on their side, who's rendering moral support, is there to back them up. So yeah, that definitely is encouraged. to have a third party present during grief counseling sessions? That's a really good question. Yes.
You probably understand this more than others. We live in the Rio Grande Valley as well.
Y'all do?
So,
Oh, we have to get connected. I'll have to give you all my business cards after this.
I had a student, I work in a high school. And I've been in the Rio Grande Valley for 20-something years.
Oh,
so
wow.
I'm a winter Texan. Yeah.
That's what brought you there?
I'm a
cool.
citizen.
Now you live there.
But I'm in the minority. So
Yes.
I was talking to a Hispanic gentleman, and he was grieving the loss of a girlfriend, and there was a bunch going on in his life. But in his hand, I saw a necklace. So I was watching him, and he was playing with it and twirling it, and it had the Santa Muerte on it. And that's a symbol I know in this culture that can be recognized, but I don't know as much about it. And so rather than allow my fear to be like, oh my God, what is going on? I just took a moment and I said, well, let me ask you, I see what you have there in your hand and the Santa Muerte, and he's like, yes. And I said, is there some sort of hope that you can receive from this belief system that you have that gives you a more positive outlook on your situation? And he said, oh yes, definitely. And he just started talking, and I found it really amazing. I mean, I'm getting chill bumps thinking about it, but because I was unaware, and I thought, oh my God, evil, horror, scary stuff, but I just removed all of that, and I just opened up and let him share his knowledge and his belief system, and it was very precious. It was just very precious.
I'm glad that you took the time to hear out your student, because even falling outs in relationships, breakups with romantic partners can really induce grief as well, and this may have been his way of honoring his grief because he loved his girlfriend very much. And I know, in high school or in college, some of us who've been in romantic relationships that ended, that can be one of the first experiences with grief that we may have gone through. But I appreciate you sharing this experience, and I look forward to getting to know y'all, hopefully even when we're back in El Valle.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Now, at least I would assume y'all two would be partners with the simulation, but unfortunately we're out of time to actually do the simulation together. But I strongly encourage you to do the simulation of grief counseling with somebody else in your own networks. I appreciate all of you very much, and I hope that you save the materials from today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend at SWPA. Thank y'all.